Hey there, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you need a website, then you should definitely check out Squarespace, and more on that later. All right, this video is going to be a deep dive comparison between the Panasonic S5 Mark II and the Sony A7IV. So first of all, why am I making this comparison? Well, there are a lot of similarities between these two cameras, but there are also some key differences, both in terms of price and features. I think there's a lot of interest and curiosity about the Panasonic S5 Mark II because Panasonic debuted phase detect autofocus in this camera. Now, there are a lot of Sony users out there and other users that are curious about how the S5 II compares against what I think is the most comparable camera from Sony, which is the Sony A7IV. Now, both of these are what I consider to be entry-level professional or prosumer level hybrid cameras. So like usual, I'll focus on video in this video because I don't do much photography. So if you are looking for a comparison in terms of photography capabilities, I'll definitely go check out another video. Now, I recently made a video doing very similar to this one, which is a deep dive comparison with the S5 Mark II and the Canon R6 Mark II, which is another comparable camera. So if you're interested in that and checking out that video, I'll leave that video linked down below. We'll kick it off by talking about image quality, which is generally the most important thing about any camera, in my opinion. And to understand the image quality a little bit more, I always like to talk about the sensors so we can understand what's going on, because that really does influence the image quality a lot. So the S5 Mark II has a 24.2 megapixel full frame sensor, and the A7IV has a 33 megapixel backside illuminated full frame sensor. So you get a little bit more megapixels, a little bit more resolution for shooting photography, but also in terms of video, you'll get higher resolution with the A7IV. The S5 II shoots 6K open gate, which we'll talk about later, but it also does a 6K oversampled 4K, whereas the A7IV doesn't do a full 7K readout like an open gate, but it does a 7K oversampled 4K image. So we'll start off by looking at some outdoor examples, and whenever I sort of compare two cameras in terms of image quality, I've lately been wanting to use the same lens on both cameras to eliminate that variable. So for these tests, I used the lens I'm shooting on right now, which is the Sigma Art EF 28mm f1.4, and I have adapters for all these cameras, and I was using manual focus anyways for these examples. So on the S5 II, I shot in Vlog, and the A7IV, I shot in S-Log3. I graded all these by hand without using any LUTs, so you could really see the difference in the colors. So taking a look at the images, I just wanted to demonstrate just a couple things outside so you can see some of the natural colors. Now, there's definitely a color shift going on with the S5 Mark II, and we'll talk about this more later on in the video, because I've always found that the A7IV has super accurate colors. But overall, the images look very, very similar in terms of detail and sharpness, and I don't really see much of a difference in terms of the overall image quality between these two cameras. Now that we saw some real life examples, let's do some pixel peeping and see if we could see any differences between these two cameras and see what's going on. I do want to make a note about noise reduction, because there are no noise reduction controls on the Sony A7IV, just like all the Sony mirrorless cameras, which is kind of frustrating because we don't know exactly what's going on and we have no way of controlling it. Now, there is noise reduction control in the S5 Mark II, but I left it at the default setting I've turned off because that's how it comes. So overall, as I said, these cameras are very similar in terms of detail and sharpness, but taking a look here at 4K 24, you might notice that the S5 II has a little bit more chroma noise, but generally these two cameras are very, very similar in 4K 24 in terms of detail, sharpness, and noise. So all those examples and that pixel peeping example were all in 4K 24. So let's get on talking about some slow motion or some higher frame rates. Now, when we talk about slow motion on these two cameras, they both have the same disadvantage. They have a cropped 4K 60. So you cannot shoot a full frame 4K 60, which makes these cameras even more comparable. So taking a look at 4K 60 on both of these, the A7IV looks just slightly better in terms of noise and sharpness, and I say that just ever so slightly. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that because the A7IV has a 7K sensor, you get a 4.6K oversampled 4K when you're in crop mode versus, I believe, a 1:1 readout in 4K 60, which is a crop on the S5 II. And then taking a look at 120 frames per second, which you can only do in 1080p, the A7IV, again, just looks maybe slightly better in terms of noise and sharpness, and I don't know how much is going to come through on YouTube, but for me staring at my computer, there's just ever so slightly an advantage for the A7IV. So overall, very similar for image quality, detail, and sharpness, etc., with a very slight advantage to the A7IV when you're doing some pixel peeping. But like I said, when you're looking at real-world examples outside, I really couldn't tell the difference between these two cameras in terms of those things. I want to take a moment to talk about the color shift that I was mentioning during the outdoor examples. Vlog coming out of the S5 II, from what I've seen, has a little bit of a green color shift, even when you use a custom white balance. And I did talk about this in the S5 II versus R6 II video. but it's pretty easy to fix with either a technical conversion LUT or using color space transform in Davinci Resolve. So taking a look at this example here, this is straight out of camera. I added a technical conversion LUT, which I got from Panasonic, which pushed it a little bit too far magenta, but I could easily adjust the colors after that LUT, add some contrast and saturation, and get a really pleasing image. So I just wanted to point this out that if you're taking vlog right out of the camera, you're probably gonna have to use a technical LUT or a color space transform to get it dialed in. Now you can download the technical LUT from Panasonic. I'll leave that linked down below. Next, let's talk about low light. And I made a whole dedicated video about the low light capabilities of the S5 Mark II, comparing it with the A7IV and the R6 Mark II. So definitely check out that video if you're looking for more details on how I perform the tests. I will leave a link to that video in the description down below. So the S5 Mark II has a dual base ISO of 640 and 4000 in Vlog, and the A7IV has a base ISO of 800 in S-Log3. Now the S5 II is a 6K oversampled 4K, and the A7IV is a 7K oversampled 4K. So generally when you have more oversampling, it will help out with the noise, but not a big difference between 7K and 6K. So taking a look at the comparison here, at the low ISO range, I would say that the A7IV is significantly cleaner. And also keep in mind, like I said before, the noise reduction in the S5 Mark II is turned off by default. There's a lot more chroma noise in the S5 II, even at the lower ISOs. When you hit ISO 4000, there's definitely some cleaning up by the S5 Mark II because that's the second base ISO, but it's still noisier both in terms of chroma noise and luma noise on the S5 II versus the A7IV. The S5 II gets pretty gnarly at around 12,800 and above, while the A7IV hangs in there really well. Overall, I would definitely say that the A7IV is cleaner at every ISO, which is no surprise to me. I've been super impressed with the A7IV in terms of how clean the image is coming out of this camera at every ISO, and including some of the higher ISOs. Before we get into looking at dynamic range, which I love to talk about, I do need to take a moment to talk about today's video sponsor, which is Squarespace. If you're a creative, a content creator, or a small business owner, you need a website. Believe me, you really do. I'm really excited to have Squarespace sponsor this video because I've been personally using Squarespace for years. Now, your website can be as simple as a landing spot for people to find your contact info and social media, but it's also a great way to show off your photos, videos, portfolio, artwork, etc. They even let you host videos directly. There's no need to link a YouTube or Vimeo video, and it looks a lot more professional and seamless. It's simple to set up a website with their amazing templates, and they make it super easy that anyone can do pretty quickly. They have lots of other cool stuff like the ability to set up an online store, schedule appointments, or have member areas. You should definitely head over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JoshSatin to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Link in description. Now I want to talk about dynamic range. So I didn't do my usual latitude or push-pull test, but what I want to show you is the normal example that I show is me standing in a dark room next to a bright window. And for this test, I expose as high as I possibly can to not clip the highlights. And then I look into the shadows. So I manually graded these two clips here without using the technical LUT, so you can just really see what's coming out of the camera. You can see that the A7IV has more dynamic range here, and you also see that green color shift, which I was talking about, but I can very easily see that the A7IV has more dynamic range. So I also want to point out that this is backed up from the lab tests that were reported from CineD. So you can see this on their website. I'll leave that link down below. They tested that the A7IV has 12.9 stops in the full frame 4K mode, and the S5 II has 12.3 stops in the 6K open gate and 12.4 stops in the 6K oversampled 4K. So clearly, the A7IV is going to have an advantage in terms of dynamic range. Next, let's get on to stabilization, which most of you watching this out there probably know that Panasonic has class-leading stabilization. So let's see how the A7IV does against the S5 II. For this test, I wanted to use native lenses because I thought they would give the camera systems the best possible opportunity to show off their stabilization. So the A7IV, I used the 24-70 G Master Mark II, which does not have lens stabilization. And for the S5 II, I used the Lumix 24 and 50mm lenses, which don't have stabilization as well. So we'll do two tests, first of which is the walking test, which is like a vlogging test, me holding the camera by the lens, not being careful whatsoever. You can first see how it looks without any stabilization applied, then applying IBIS in both cameras, and then lastly, IBIS plus electronic, which is also known as the active stabilization on the A7IV. I would definitely say that the S5 Mark II does better for the walking test. Not really much of a surprise here. Now let's take a look at some static shots. That's just me holding a camera with a 50mm lens and trying to make it look like a tripod as much as possible. So the image here out of camera, you can see what it looks like with no stabilization. Now, when I add IBIS to both cameras, they look pretty similar to me. And then the next step, when I have IBIS and electronic in the S5 II and the active stabilization, they also look pretty similar. But where you add the boost mode in the S5 II, that's where the camera really shines because it looks super solid and there's definitely less of a crop. So I've always thought Sony Stab was good for static shots, but not walking shots. But the S5 II definitely has an advantage in terms of stabilization across the board. Next, let's talk about rolling shutter. So most of you out there probably know that the A7IV suffers from terrible rolling shutter, but let's see how it compares against the S5 II. So for this test, I did it in 4K 24 in a full frame, oversampled 4K mode. And so taking a look at this here, I would say that the S5 II is just slightly better, but neither of them perform really well. But just want to see how they look against each other. So also referring to CineD's lab tests, the A7IV got 26.8 milliseconds and the S5 II was 22 milliseconds in their full frame 4K 25 frame per second. And when you compare that in APS-C mode, you get 13 milliseconds on the A7IV and 14.3 on the S5 Mark II. So I would give a slight advantage here to the S5 II for rolling shutter, but neither of them perform really well. Now on to overheating and battery life. I find that these cameras have pretty similar battery life. Both of them are fine. But there is a big difference in overheating. So the S5 II really shouldn't overheat because it has a fan. But if you are using the S5 II, make sure you change the recording max temperature setting to high. And to find this, you go under Menu, Wrench, Monitor Display, and Thermal Management, and you can set it to high. And I've had any issues with overheating on the S5 Mark II. Now, I have had overheating issues on the A7IV. I've owned this camera for quite a while, and I've had issues in 4K 24 for long record times in the studio, and also when I'm using it outside in the heat. It also definitely overheats a lot quicker in 4K 60. So if you're looking for a camera that can do long record times and you don't have to stress about overheating, I definitely would recommend the S5 Mark II. Next, let's get on talking about autofocus, which is a huge deal because Panasonic debuted their phase detect autofocus system in the S5 Mark II, and there's a lot of curiosity about how it works. So there are a lot of ways to test autofocus, and that would probably be a very long and detailed video, but I'll try to sum it up as best as possible here based on my experience of using this camera over the last month and obviously owning the Sony A7IV and other Sony cameras over the last few years. And I'll spoil it up front here. The A7IV is better autofocus. In my opinion, Sony has class-leading autofocus, but the S5 II did a little bit better than I thought it would, and I want to show you some of that stuff here. But I had some issues. So when I was filming my studio tour video, which if you haven't seen before, I'll leave that link down below. I talk about all the gear that I use in here, and I use a lot of really cool stuff with some great ideas. You should definitely go check that out. But in addition to that, when I was filming, I noticed that the S5 II lost autofocus on me a few times, and that was in a well-lit situation. And I was also using the S5 II for a live stream somewhat recently, and it was losing focus every once in a while. So it didn't hold me 100% of the time. And to me, as someone who's filming myself often, which is one of the reasons I would want to use this camera, I couldn't really rely on it for that sort of stuff. Now, for the testing that I want to show you here and to demonstrate this a little bit further, in terms of the autofocus settings, I use the default settings out of the S5 II. On the A7IV, I put them right down the middle. So the autofocus speed was at 4 and the sensitivity was at 3. And for the first test here, comparing these two cameras, I used the face eye detect on the S5 II. And I noticed that definitely struggles when you move your hands in front of your face. It tends to lose focus in situations like that. And for someone like myself that talks a lot with my hands, this can definitely be a problem. Now I want to make one note because there are two options to select with the autofocus settings on the S5 II. There's the face eye detect and there's also the human detect. For normal talking head stuff, I haven't seen much of a difference between those two, but if the subject, or I mean the human, is moving around in the scene, like if you're vlogging or walking around or whatever, I noticed the human does better, but when you're sitting here just talking to the camera or something like that where the subject's not moving very much, I really didn't see much of a difference between those two modes. Next, let's get on talking about the touch tracking autofocus. And the way I tested this was I set up a slider and I put a little Lego Grogu on there for the camera to focus on. Now, I did this because it would give me a consistent test between both cameras, and this kind of situation is very tough for any camera. As the subject moves away from the camera and towards the camera, it's constantly having to adjust the focus distance, and this can be really tough, and that's why I decided to do this. I would say they both struggled at different times. Neither were perfect, but maybe give a slight edge to the A7IV, but the S5 II definitely did pretty well. Another thing is I wanted to show you what the back of the screen looked like, because as this test was going on, the A7IV tracked a little bit better when Grogu was a little bit further away, and maybe that would be better for more extreme movements if the subject is moving around the frame a little bit more, because it definitely seemed to have a little bit more sensitivity to that. But Grogu was basically in the same part of the frame throughout that shot, so it wasn't a huge difference. So if you have a subject that's moving around more in the frame, I think the A7IV would probably do a better job. But overall, in terms of touch tracking, autofocus, I think the S5 Mark II did pretty well. One other thing I want to point out about the phase detect autofocus system on the S5 II is something that's been reported by several other people online and been documented but I haven't tested it myself, and that the phase detect autofocus does not work when you're in full frame 1080p at 50 frames per second and up. So if you're shooting at like 1080p 60 or 1080p 120, you don't have phase detect autofocus, and it defaults back to some sort of version of contrast detect autofocus. If you're shooting in 4K 60, of course that's in crop mode, so it can handle phase detect autofocus. But again, full frame, 1080p, 50 frames per second and up, you lose phase detect autofocus. So overall, I am really impressed with the first version of Panasonic's phase detect autofocus system. Now, I've used most of the Canon and Sony cameras out there, and I'm very familiar with their autofocus capabilities, but the A7IV II is not quite at the same level as Canon and Sony. So just keep that in perspective. As of right now, there might be firmware updates and new cameras coming out and stuff like that, and this is the first version of their autofocus system. It definitely, in my opinion, isn't quite at the same level as Canon and Sony. Next, we'll take a look at build quality and ergonomics. Both cameras have decent build quality. I probably give a slight advantage here to the A7IV II because it has a sort of metal body, and I like the buttons and dials are very tactile and clicky, very solid feeling. I've really never loved the ergonomics of the A7IV. I've just kind of gotten used to it. I usually prefer Canon cameras, but I think, prefer the A7IV II slightly over the A7IV. But again, no big complaints. They both work really well. And one thing I love about these two cameras is they both have 3 exposure controls, which you don't see on every camera nowadays. So we'll stop by looking at the tops of the cameras. Take a look at the tops of the cameras here. There's definitely some differences I want to point out. One big difference is that there's nothing going on over here on the A7IV. One thing that's similar is they both have power switches on the right-hand side of the camera. So over here on the A7IV in front of the shutter, and over here on the A7IV II, which I love because when you're holding the camera in your right hand, you can just flick the power on and off really easily. Now, the A7IV II is definitely geared more towards video, and there are dedicated buttons for that. So for example, it has a button for white balance and ISO. But for me, I've changed the custom button 2 over here to work the white balance because that's the same location on the FX3 for me. So that's kind of muscle memory. Another difference here is that you have a dial here to change between photo, video, and S&Q, so you can easily change that there without diving into the menu, and then you have access to the mode dial up here. So just a couple differences on the top. Taking a look at the backs of the cameras, there's a few differences I want to point out. First of which is the focus control, which I love because it's so easy to access. You can change between manual focus and autofocus, and then if you press the button in the middle, you can also change all the autofocus settings without having to dive into the menu. I love that because it's something I'm obviously changing quite often. The other difference here is that you have the Q menu on the A7IV II, which is very customizable, and you can put a lot of different stuff in there. Now you have the FN button and the FN menu on the A7IV, but you can't have as much stuff in there, and it's not really as customizable. I really like the implementation on the A7IV II. Now I wish that the A7IV had the newest Sony menu system with that main menu because they have that in cameras like the FX3 and the FX30, and I find that almost everything is in there. I absolutely love that. So just a few differences in the back. So let's get on talking about the LCDs and EVF. So the LCDs have a different resolution. The A7IV has a 3-inch 1.04 million dot, and the A7IV II is a 3-inch 1.84 million dot. So big difference in terms of resolution on the A7V Mark II. When I was shooting outside, I didn't really prefer either one. Neither of them were super bright. I prefer the LCDs and the Canon cameras, but anyways, that's what you got. And then for the EVF, they're both the same at 3.68 million dots. So taking a look at the grip sides of these two cameras, you can see that they both have decently sized grips. I think Sony has made a good improvement on their last generation of bodies to have a deeper grip. If I were to pick one or the other, I'd probably choose the A7IV II. It's a little bit bigger, nicer to hold, but the A7IV is pretty fine, and I haven't really had many complaints about the grip. Couple things I want to point out on this side of the camera is one of which is where the strap attaches. You have this built-in like loop, I don't know what you call this, but on the A7IV you have the older style with the little triangle that goes in there and flaps around, which I've taken off because I hate those things. So I do like this system a lot better, and you see these on the Canon cameras as well. I also want to point out that the remote port is on this side of the camera on the A7IV II. And then let's talk about the memory cards. So they have slightly different setups. The A7IV has a dual card slot in the top one, so that's CF Express Type A and SD, and the bottom one is just SD. And on the A7IV II, you have dual SD cards. So the A7IV has that additional dual card slot for the CFA, so you can get faster read and write speeds and stuff like that. But you have dual cards in both. You can do relive recording and redundant recording and all that kind of stuff in both of these cameras. Now onto the other side of the camera where all the ports are, and they're kind of similar. They both have full-size HDMI ports. That's right, full size, which is great. And they both have 3.5 millimeter headphone and mic jacks and USB-C. The one addition here is that you have the micro USB port on the A7IV versus the remote port, which is on the other side of the A7V II. Now, one thing I want to point out is about the doors on these cameras. They're slightly different. I really do prefer the doors, or the flaps, whatever you call them, on the A7 IV. They're a little bit easier to use. I find the ones on the S5 II are just a little bit fiddly to like get them to sit right in there. And one thing I do like is that there's a separate little door here for just the mic jack. So if you're out running and gunning, vlogging, stuff like that, and the only thing you have to plug in is a microphone, you have a little door right here for that. And it stays out of the way when you flip out the screen too. So I do like that. In terms of the batteries for these two cameras, they're both similar in terms of size and capacity. The Sony has a capacity of 16.4 watt hours, and the Panasonic has a capacity of 16 watt hours. As I said, they're both pretty similar in terms of size. Now, one thing I want to say about the batteries and stuff with these cameras is that they don't come with a battery charger. So you can charge them over USB, but if you're looking for a dedicated battery charger, and I recommend getting the OEM brand, you're gonna have to pay for that. So keep that in mind, they don't come with battery chargers. All right, so what's the same between these two cameras? Well, they both shoot 4K 10-bit 422 up to 60 frames a second with a crop and 4K 60. Neither of them have a raw output option to record video. They have a very similar hybrid body design with a flippy screen. You also get an APS-C crop mode in both cameras with a 1.5x times crop. That's gonna be a 1:1 readout on the S5 II and a 4.6K oversampled 4K in the A7 IV. You also get a full-size HDMI port, and on the hot shoe, you can get the XLR module, which you can plug in XLR microphones. So if you're looking for professional audio solution, you can do that on both of these cameras. Now on to some of the differences between these two cameras. The first one is that the S5 II can shoot in 6K open gate, which is a 10-bit 420, not a 10-bit 422, but it looks absolutely amazing. And if you're not familiar with open gate, it's a full sensor readout, and in hybrid cameras, they have sensors that are in a ratio of 3:2 for taking photos. So generally when you do video, it crops it down, takes the top and the bottom off to spit out either a 17:9 or 16:9 ratio. But the fact that this camera shoots open gate gives you a full readout of the sensor. It allows you to have a different looking aspect ratio to play with, but it's also great for cropping for vertical video because you can shoot once without rotating the camera, and it has a lot more real estate vertically to get more pixels there. So it's really handy, and I hope to see this in more manufacturers moving forwards. You see it in Fuji cameras, but I'd love to see it in Canon and Sony coming soon. I hope. It's a really cool feature. So there are a lot of extra video features that are in the S5 II that are not in the A7 IV. So some of them are the fact that the S5 II has waveform and shutter angle. You can also load custom LUTs into the S5 II for both viewing in camera when you're shooting in vlog and also exporting over HDMI if you're using an external monitor, or if you're doing live streaming and stuff like that. Now these features, the custom LUT features, are in cameras like the Sony FX3 and FX30, but that's in their cinema line. That's not in the A7 IV. There's also great anamorphic support on the S5 II, so you can do in-camera de-squeezing. You can also have separate controls for IBIS for anamorphic lenses. Super cool stuff. In terms of aspect ratios, of course, we get 6K open gate on the S5 II, but you also get DCI, which is 17:9, versus you only get UHD on the A7 IV, which is 16:9. In terms of codecs, the S5 II can only shoot in long-op or IPB, and the A7 IV gives you an additional codec of the XAVC-SI, which is an all-I codec, but neither of these cameras can spit out RAW. The S5 IIX, which is coming out in a few months, will be able to do that. But again, for this comparison here, we're just talking about the S5 II. The A7 IV also has focus breathing compensation, which is a really cool feature for some of Sony's lenses. A lot of the lenses that you can get for the Panasonic camera, like some of the Lumix lenses, they don't have a lot of focus breathing, but the focus breathing compensation is cool because it totally eliminates it with certain lenses. Overheating is a big difference. Of course, as I mentioned, the A7 IV can overheat in long run times in 4K 24, and also in 4K 60, it will overheat faster. Now, the S5 II will not because it has a built-in fan. All right, so what do you get with the A7 IV over the S5 II? You get more dynamic range, which is really important to me and probably to some of you out there. You also get all-eye recording, which is not really that important to me personally. I generally shoot in IPB or long op to save on space. If you're not familiar with all-eye, basically it records every single frame when it compresses the video, and that way it is a little bit easier to edit if you have an older computer. Also, if you have a fast-moving subject or the camera's moving quickly, you might get less artifacts. For most of my work, I shoot in IPB anyways. One feature that I love is the fact that the sensor is covered by the shutter when you shut off the camera. This is super handy when you're shooting outside or anywhere where you're changing lenses, keeps dust off the sensor. The S5 II doesn't have that. I wish every camera did. In terms of autofocus, you get a more complete and reliable autofocus system in the A7 IV for all sorts of different stuff, but also in terms of having phase detect autofocus in all frame rates and modes and not having to think about that. And you also get focus breathing compensation in the A7 IV. All right, so what do you get with the S5 II over the A7 IV? Well, you get a lot of those extra video functions, which I mentioned earlier. So shutter angle, waveform, custom LUTs, all the anamorphic support, DCI, open gate, and there's a lot more options for codecs and frame rates in the camera. I know you can't get all eye, but there's a lot more options there to choose from. You also get no overheating and you get better stabilization. Now on to my conclusions, pricing, and overall recommendations. So we'll start with the price. The S5 II is currently selling for $2,000 and the A7IV at $2,500. So that $500 price difference is not insignificant. You could put that towards lensing and lighting and accessories, but they're in the same ballpark. So which camera should you buy? Well, I thought this would be more clear after doing all this testing, but the more I test cameras, I think it's harder to give an opinion about this because all these cameras are so good nowadays. It really depends on how you'll be using the camera. So as I've been saying throughout the video, the S5 II is definitely more video focused. You get all those extra video features, longer run times, and neither of these cameras have the full frame 4K 60, so they all have a disadvantage there. But one big advantage of the A7IV is the autofocus, both in terms of the overall reliability of it, but also the fact that you can use it in every mode and every frame rate and all that kind of stuff. So if you are in front of the camera a lot, I would say the A7IV is going to be a better bet. You're going to be worrying about the autofocus a little bit less. If you're behind the camera more, maybe using manual focus lenses, anamorphic stuff, maybe the S5 II makes more sense because you get that overall, you get all the extra benefits for a video focused camera. Now, if you are looking to buy into either of these two systems, it's always important to think about the lenses that are available and the overall ecosystem. So starting with Panasonic, it's part of the L-mount Alliance. And so Lumix, Sigma, and Leica make lenses for the L-mount Alliance. Now, there are a lot of available lenses there, but there are some gaps. But you can generally get what you're looking for. And I have to say, one thing I would recommend are the Lumix Prime. So I currently have the 24 and 50, but they make a full set of 18, 24, 35, 50, and 85. They're great for video. The autofocus works well. They're quiet and they have little focus breathing. So those are great. Sigma also makes some great zoom lenses and they have some higher end levels from Lumix. Of course, you have the Leica lenses too. So there are some options out there, but overall, I would say there's a huge advantage for Sony. Their E-mount has so many lenses, both from Sony and from third-party manufacturers like Tamron and Sigma. So huge advantage overall to the lens system for Sony. It's really tough to know what both of these companies will be coming out with in the next few years, both in terms of bodies and lenses. Well, Sony already has a lot of lenses, but in terms of lenses coming out for the L-mount from Leica, Lumix, and Sigma, I'm not really sure what's coming out, but keep that in mind. When you're looking to invest in a camera, you have to think about the entire ecosystem. So as I said at the beginning of the video, there's a lot of interest and curiosity about the S5 II now that it has the phase detect autofocus. So if you are a Sony user, should you be thinking about switching from Sony to Panasonic? Well, in my opinion, if you're heavily invested into Sony, I would probably not switch at the moment. And this really will depend on your needs and what's important to you. But if you're heavily invested into Sony, you know that Sony has a very deep ecosystem in terms of bodies and lenses and very reliable autofocus. And if you're filming yourself often, that's going to be really important. And that's important for someone like myself. But if those extra video features are important to you, Panasonic does offer a lot of cool things. And I think there's going to be a lot more to come. But remember, buy a camera for what it does now, not for what it might do later with an update. I think there's a lot of people that buy into a system thinking, or buy a camera that's going to evolve and change with firmware updates. It may. I think it will. I think Panasonic is going to come up with updates for this camera. I think the future cameras will have even better autofocus. But don't buy a camera for future updates, so just keep that in mind. All right, a lot in this video. I really appreciate you watching, so thank you so much. If you enjoyed this, please consider hitting subscribe down below. We'll see you in the next one.